let me give kind of the perspective on this. It's been really entertaining and informative to be giving this talk after hearing the other excellent talks so far today. And I think there's a way to kind of frame what I'm talking about in kind of as a comparison or contrast with some of the others. I am an economist, and so I think about policy interventions in terms of market failures. And I think of there being three relevant kinds, potentially of three relevant kinds of market failures for policy interventions of this or many other sorts. The first is asymmetric information, which I confess I hadn't really thought about very much until the last talk. Although that depends upon the inability of ISPs to convey what kind of quality they have. So I'm going to leave that aside for now, although that may come up. The second and the main one that has come up in the discussion today and that permeates the discussion in the U.S., which I know much better than the discussion here, is market power. And sort of one of the main points I have today is I think market power is not the most helpful way to look at this issue. The third justification for public policy intervention, however, is externalities. That was why I asked this morning whether congestion was an externality or could it be internalized by the providers. The thing that got me interested in this, besides having some issues with the market power side of this discussion, which I'll talk about a bit, is whether looking at this in network externality terms might help frame the discussion a little differently. And so that's basically what the talk today is about, is sort of suggesting that instead of thinking about this in market power terms, think about this in terms of a particular kind of network externality, which I would call a content externality, which is basically if you post a link on your website, you want your viewers of your website to have some confidence that if they click on that link, they'll get something. And that may rationalize not full network neutrality, but my modest proposal, which is a minimum quality standard. To propose that doesn't mean that I have answers to all of the many questions about it, and I'll get to that as well. Okay, we've had the overview so far, discrimination in content treatment, or whether you should even charge content providers a positive price. I think as Professor Cruz mentioned, that in some senses the debate could be viewed as between those two things to some degree. This is a very hot topic. Don't need people, this is the last place probably that needs to be pointed out. When I gave a version of this talk last May, there were 90 papers on SSRN with the words net neutrality or network neutrality in the title or abstract, and I would guess there's probably at least a few dozen more since then. So there's a lot of stuff out there. The pros and cons, we'll talk a little bit more about these in some detail. The pros are basically limiting exercises of market power, at least in the U.S., and in a broadband duopoly, and some of the experimental results suggest that duopolies may be a problem, and I'll come back to that at the end, I hope. And the second is basically to protect the little guy website, and it's concerned that as the big guys get a better deal. The arguments against it, we've heard a lot about efficient congestion management today as a topic, that it might preclude that. The second is that the market's competitive. Some people argue that regulation is at best premature, and that unwarranted content intrusion reduces demand, profits, and a bunch of other things that make it costly. Now, as I said before, my claim is that network effects, not market power, is the issue. Now, if this is framed a little bit in U.S. terms, I apologize for that. So if I say anything that's not clear, please ask some questions later. But where I'm sort of coming from on this is that I am somewhat unfortunately old enough to remember that back in the days of wireline telephone service, the big concern was a universal service externality, at least in the United States, which rationalized subsidies of telephone service, very controversial subsidies in economic terms, no need to get into that. But the idea was, at least in part, there were some citizenship-like issues associated with that, but the rationale, at least in part, is that my phone is more valuable the more other people have a phone as well. And so that rationalized wide coverage. And so what I wonder is whether there's a similar externality on the content side based upon this reasonable expectation consideration that I just mentioned. And to some degree, if there is this content-side network externality, competition makes matters worse because it's harder for the externality to be internalized. How I regulate my content affects subscribers to many, many, many other networks. Not just, if there were just a monopoly in some sense, it would be as internalized as the congestion externalities that we've heard about before might be. I'll talk a little bit about inter-carrier negotiations also, touch on that. Now, if I'm right, and that's a big if, that justifies to me not full network neutrality, that's what I mean by NN up there, but minimum service quality. Not requiring equal treatment of all websites, but a minimum quality of service to all, depending upon user expectations, technology, of things like that. This was implied, I think, in the old universal service mandates. If a telephone company was obliged to provide universal service at discounted rates, that doesn't mean that you could hand tin cans and strings to customers and say, good luck. You know, if that's this picture out of the old telephone, you start yelling a can and it comes out the other. You know, there was at least, I don't know how explicit it was in the regulations, but there had to have been something that you had to provide some level of quality to meet these goals. And there's an analogy here for cars, and I didn't include BMWs here just because I was in Germany. In the U.S., and I'm sure here, there are many regulations requiring all cars to have certain levels of safety features. The brake lights have to work, things like that. Perhaps they have to have, you know, safety equipment in them like airbags. But that doesn't mean that every car has to be a top quality car. They may have to satisfy some minimum to be drivable on the road, but that doesn't mean they all have to be as good. So I always think of that as a possible analogy here. And a perhaps benefit of thinking about this minimum service quality standards is that it avoids a lot of the alleged net neutrality costs. It permits two-sided pricing, creates more flexibility, provides more incentives to innovate, and so on. It's not perfect, but it's far less intrusive than saying everybody has to be treated the same way and that you can't charge content providers anything. Now, as far as I can tell, recent proposals haven't talked about this. In the U.S., there's a joint proposal from Verizon and Google, which doesn't raise this. The FCC's Preserving the Open Internet Notice of Proposed Rulemaking doesn't mention this. I didn't see it in the EU solicitation for public consultation, although maybe it's there and maybe others mention it. You know, everybody in this room would have a better handle on that than I do. Some of the papers on this, one's gotten a lot of attention by Van Schweik on what a non-discrimination rule should look like, doesn't talk about this. I happened to run across this quote and sort of trying to look around. Tim Berners-Lee, who you might regard as the father of the internet as we know it, I found this great quote saying, the moment you let neutrality go, you lose the web as it is. You lose the idea that you can click a link and go anywhere. Well, that's not true if there's a minimum quality standard. You know, it may be that some links are better than others, but that doesn't mean that they all have to be the same. It's alluded to in a recent extensive report by New York University, but they still come out in favor of net neutrality. Arguments in favor. Tying broadband service to providers' other services, for example, no vonage or Skype. We've talked about that before. I'll say a little bit more about that later. That there are some objections to upstream pricing because if you do that, there are some scenarios at least where welfare could go down. I don't think those are very general arguments, but we'll talk a bit about those as well. And there's the price discrimination, which we've heard about before. And actually want to focus more, again, just in a second, on the second of these about committing not to extract surplus from content innovators and what I mean by that. That probably doesn't have a very clear meaning at the moment. Now, other arguments against net neutrality, besides the congestion management one, is that it precludes high-quality offerings which would reduce innovation at either end in terms of having higher quality pipelines or content that would be most valuable if you could guarantee high quality. Zero pricing limits ability to share in revenues, which also might impede innovation. Forcing uniform quality makes some get less than what they want and others more than they need. That's the BMW argument, basically. If all cars had to be the same, people who don't mind paying lower prices for lower quality cars like me. I have a 20-year-old car at home. Some of us who don't mind low quality because we're cheap would be hurt, and others who want to get high quality couldn't get what they want. We've heard a lot about transparency as a remedy and also competition law, and there are some differences between the U.S. and EU, I think, on the competition law side of this I want to get to. And one underlying premise that the opponents make is that broadband markets are competitive. In the U.S., most people have access to two wireline providers, cable and the telephone company. Telephone company is sometimes fiber optic, sometimes DSL service, and there's more and more wireless broadband as well. Okay, more on the market power. Does an ISP, or transmission content provider with market power, have an incentive to restrict content and applications in general? No, this is that ICE principle that was discussed a little bit before, but I have my own critique of that as well. But the argument in favor is that increased content increases demand for ISPs and just what people will pay. That would likely increase price and certainly profits, but there are exceptions. Now, some of these exceptions are benign. There may be legitimate complementarities about this. For example, AT&T and Apple working it out so you could develop a network that would run the iPhone. Now, on the negative side, you can have strategic prevention that the content provider would do that would prevent entry into the. I'm sorry, that's a little awkward there. That would discourage the content provider from entering the ISP market eventually. That's what I meant by that there. That basically the ISP doesn't allow Skype on the theory that maybe if you let Skype into the content side, it will someday be a competitor on the delivery side. I doubt that that's empirically a very serious concern, simply because I think the barriers to entry for this, especially for wireline, are high, if not prohibitive. Price discrimination has been talked about. Just to point out something that I think is very familiar to most of the economists here. That's not necessarily a bad thing if it allows some people to get internet service cheaply, if they're not very application intensive. There's also something that's come up. Somebody mentioned something about this. The citizen action sorts of arguments. There's a recent argument I've seen which basically says that suppose that my demand for an ISP service is predicated upon the idea that other subscribers are going to be looking at the same applications, such as the same sort of TV news things not having a fragmented audience, that sort of thing. That maybe there's some argument there about having things being uniform on the content side, or at least some uniformity. Now, the famous exception to this, besides the strategic argument, is regulation, which was used to break up the phone company. Now, that gets to the antitrust part in the United States. I had asked a question before about whether Article 102 could be applicable in the EU and was assured that it could be. I don't believe that's true in the United States. I don't expect people to go through all of this table here, but what this basically compares is US v. AT&T is the antitrust case that led to the breakup of the phone company. Verizon versus Trinco is a decision that the US Supreme Court made in 2004 involving similar sorts of discrimination in terms of access to local loops. Under the U.S., and basically what this says is that except for the outcome chart, the circumstances were qualitatively identical. In the first one, it led to probably the strongest industrial policy intervention in the history of the United States, breaking up the telephone company. In the second case, the U.S. Supreme Court essentially said that if there's a sectoral regulator with authority over the industry, antitrust laws should not be applied to that circumstance. So maybe you could apply 102 here, but I don't think antitrust is actually going to be able to come to the rescue if you think that there's a market power problem with net neutrality. Okay, the little guy argument. This is a vision that a lot of people have here. And we think about this, we think about Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs in the garage in California, or Bill Gates and Paul Allen doing whatever they were doing in the dorm at Harvard. Tim Berners-Lee, says, hey, wouldn't it be nice to look at the coffee machine at the Cambridge Physics Lab? Seth Parker, the Netscape guy, the Google, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, the Google people, and Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. So this idea that, geez, we have these little guys, little innovators. Now, would they be worse off without net neutrality? I don't know, for the reasons I've talked about before. But I sort of wonder how reasonable a concern this is, or whether this is a romantic vision, of basically looking at the internet essentially as volunteer work. By the way, the best thing I ever heard, this is an aside, but this phrase reminds me, the best description I ever heard about university faculty is that they treat everything they do as volunteer work. So those of you who are academics out here may appreciate that. Teach a class? What? Okay. So these are multi-billion-dollar industries here. Whether or not this is something that's really something you can rely on, this romantic vision, isn't clear. Let me sort of move through this a little more quickly. Now, there's a better innovation argument, I think, but I sort of wonder how empirically sound it is. And the idea goes something like this. Let's say I have a monopoly ISP. Somebody comes up with a great content idea. I want people to do that because I own this ISP. People want my content. People want it more if there's better content. Unfortunately, once somebody's come up with that content, I'm now the bottleneck. I can extract some of their profits, maybe all of their profits, depending upon the bargaining situation. If they know that, that's going to reduce their incentive to innovate. I would like to pre-commit not to do that, but I can't. So maybe I want to have the government do that for me. And Jan's paper talks about this in terms of whether or not you could do this by prioritizing congestion in one way shape, or by offering different qualities, level of service. I sort of wonder how empirically confirmed that is, given the thousands of iPhone apps, thousands of programs for Windows, and so on. Although, some point, well, there's an app for everything except Google Voice, although I think iPhone now is letting Google Voice go. But I think Stefan was telling me that you can't use Skype on Microsoft Windows phones, so, whatever. So maybe there's an issue there with that. Okay, a little bit on two-sided markets. Basically, I'll just sort of skip through this to say that that you can get optimal prices going in any direction. To say that the prices should be no more than zero, yes, there will be models where people say that's better off. I doubt that they're really very general. So, getting to the bottom line here, should market power be the issues? Do these arguments disappear if the broadband market's competitive? Multiple providers are bad only if it leads to complementary monopoly pricing, which you might get to some degree, but it neglects this positive externality that I was talking about before. And I have in a paper greatly in need of revision, in part because of things I've heard this morning, that one come up with a very simple model for this, but it's not really worth putting up here. It basically sort of says the obvious, which is that if my content decisions change the value of your network, then I'm not going to invest as much in quality as I should because I don't capture the value that goes to your network. I mean, it's really nothing more than that. Now, so if we have this content externality, what should be done about it? Well, this gets to something we've talked about before, or people have talked about earlier here. Maybe you could have inter-carrier quality agreements like these inter-carrier congestion agreements. Well, the old antitrust person in me doesn't really think too highly of remedies that involve getting all of the competing ISPs together in a room to decide what service quality they're going to decide to offer. Maybe they'll talk about some other things as well while they do that. And antitrust may not help depending upon what the regulatory structure is, at least in the US. And again, the problem is worse that there's lots of providers because the externality is harder to internalize, so they have this great meeting, and so you may get this big cartel. You wouldn't have had anything. That leaves what I might call the borrowing from the US healthcare debate, if you want to call it that, the public option, which is to set a minimum standard to deal with this. And we've got examples of this in other settings. There are standards for electricity reliability, standards for preventing harm to the network by regulating equipment, calls for quality standards in cellular service, wireless service, although in the US that's probably more an asymmetric information consumer protection thing than a network externality. There's drawbacks to this proposal. Firms might set high quality levels already. We don't know that there's necessarily a problem. People, Johannes and others have asked, how big a deal is this really? Minimum quality, if this is going to be binding, it's going to increase the cost of the network. Increasing the cost of the network presumably is going to increase the price of the network. You increase the price of the network, you get fewer subscribers. You have a network externality cost on the other side. You may maintain congestion in order to try to earn rents from it. That's what Jan's talked about in his paper. Increasing the minimum could reduce the premium quality. Hey, people know I can get this minimum. Why should I pay more for a higher service? And that might cause some problems. But however, even if the average quality falls, the variance falls. We heard something about risk aversion before, and so maybe risk-averse content providers would be better off with a minimum standard. And then I've heard non-economic arguments, come back to those before, which is that you could view broadband access as a kind of a library right of sorts, rather than something that's determined purely on general economic grounds. Other concessions. You ask me what the standard should be for minimum quality? I don't have a clue. That's a difference between theory and practice. Should it vary by region? There's a real concern about whether incumbents would use minimum quality standards to suppress competition from low-cost substandard providers. Do the benefits exceed the cost of this? And this is where the congestion stuff comes in. And I confess that if I talk about this and an engineer in the room says, no, we can't do that, I have no answer to that. That doesn't mean they're right, doesn't mean they're wrong. A lot of telecommunications engineers said we couldn't break up AT&T either, but, and I actually happen to think that worked out okay, but anyhow, you never know. And there's issues of implementation, enforcement. Is expected quality a stochastic thing? It would almost have to be, so how would you determine whether it had been met? And people have talked about that already. And it's a moving target. You've got changes in expectations, changes in costs, and so on. However, I think the costs of this proposal, whatever they are, and they are there, are far less than those with full network neutrality. Getting to sort of closing wrap up here, this kind of, I guess, speaks to the citizen, the community basic rights as we were talking about before. Some of what inspires this, although these may be quite rare, as Johannes pointed out, are these horror stories. TELUS is a broadband provider in Canada that supposedly blocked a website to its union during a labor dispute. America Online blocked emails mentioning a website that was lobbying against its pay-to-send email proposal. Yeah, if that had worked, I'm sure AOL would have survived. We've heard about concerns with deep packet inspection by another DPI. I gave a talk at someplace in the U.S. called the Digital Policy Institute, whose initials are also DPI, and then people are giving these talks about how horrible DPI is, and I was wondering whether they were thinking about changing the name. And also minimum quality standards implies no content-based full blocking, which preventing censorship is a social value, perhaps the democracy things we've talked about before, which are important. The problem about blocking, I think, is more severe when you have monopolies or people with market power exercising that power on behalf of something other than profit. If all they care about is profit, they like to make money, put on lots of content. If they care about other things, political, for example, they might leave stuff off, which gets to a problem in the U.S. regarding this, which is unfortunately, there's a premise in the U.S. law that freedom of speech means that the freedom of the person who owns the speech facilities to control the content that goes over them, not the freedom of the audience to be able to use them as they see fit. And there are some stories there I could get into. So a few concluding thoughts and I'm done. We've heard already, does the FCC have jurisdiction? And right now it's not clear that they do. I'll just leave the technicalities of that. A second is, if you think market power is a problem, you need to have some sort of price regulation. After all, they could just charge the same monopoly price to everybody. And so when we broke up the phone company, there were equal access had to be provided at regulated access charges. So who's going to decide what the terms and conditions are going to be if you had full network neutrality? And finally, and this is something that I sort of wonder about, and some of the experimental results actually also sort of bring this up. Traditionally, at least in the U.S., price regulation applies only to pretty clear monopolies. Because regulation, as some people mention, is kind of inflexible, you kind of lock your way into various things, it's sort of hard to change, so you only incur those costs when you're in an extreme situation. In Canada, I participated in a proceeding about deregulating local telephone service, and the idea was, hey, two's enough to get regulators out of there. Here I sort of wonder where, if we think we're going to regulate, in most cases you have at least two providers, many more. Should we regulate situations that aren't monopolies? And as with so many other things I've said, I don't know the answer to that either. So with that, I'm done. Thanks very much.